As DC fans, we are definitely used to this studio making a lot of really stupid decisions. And unfortunately, time and time again, this often leads to us fans suffering the most and having to deal with either very stupid projects or very stupid rules with projects. And speaking of stupid rules for projects, DC decided in the early 2000s to create something called the Bat Embargo. Something that is so asinine, makes absolutely no sense, and puts so many limitations on what DC, in my opinion, has been best at since the 90s. And that something is their animated projects. And that's why today we're talking the Bat Embargo ruined DC. But before we get into anything, guys, please, for me, like this video, subscribe to the page, and hit that noti bell. All right, the Bat Embargo. Something I have been mentioning on this channel a couple of times. Honestly, I did a lot more research for this subject just because there are a lot of false things out there about what the Bat Embargo is, but also what it is not, and what projects it definitively did affect versus which ones were just rumored to have been affected. So, first and foremost, I'm going to go through all of the projects that were rumored to be impacted by the Bat Embargo, but in fact were just either licensing issues or studio and creator producer decisions to leave them out of said project. So first and foremost, we have Smallville, a show that I thought was impacted by the Bat Embargo. No characters from Gotham City actually appear in the series, except for one side character that was related to Lex Luthor in some way and then blew up in a limousine. So he had no actual relation to anyone in Gotham other than saying he was from Gotham, but that was just a creative decision to never have anyone related to Batman or any Batman characters in this project. And with that, it does make a lot of sense. This is before Superman was even a thing in Smallville. He was just Clark Kent, so to have Batman appear, it would feel very, very weird in my opinion. A couple of the other projects that I personally thought were affected were projects like Arrow, The Flash, Titans, specifically the live action Titans series, and it's just not true. All of these decisions were either due to licensing or due to creative differences that they could not agree on a storyline to bring in the character of Batman. Specifically with Titans, because they did in a way bring Bruce Wayne in, and while it is true they weren't allowed to have him in the actual bat suit, they did still have him in a silhouette, and they just didn't show a close-up of him in the bat suit, and it was very dark so you couldn't see the bat symbol, but he had the cape, he had the ears, it was clearly him in a bat suit. That was not something that was an impact from the Bat Embargo, but rather it was a decision made by the studio. Getting on to Arrow and The Flash, now these were more of licensing issues as The Flash and Arrow did air on the CW, so the CW would have essentially had to license the character of Batman from the studios, and they obviously did not want to do that. That's very similar to the show Gotham, where Batman only appeared in, I believe, the last episode, and he wasn't on screen for a very long time. This was also because they did not want to pay the licensing fee associated with the character of Batman, which is very understandable, but it is not a direct impact from the Bat Embargo. So first, let's get into what exactly the Bat Embargo is. It is something that came out between 2004 and 2005, and it essentially limited the character of Batman and also any surrounding characters for Batman, whether it be his villains, Commissioner Gordon, members of the Bat family, even Alfred, all had strict limitations across animation. And that's a very important thing because it really didn't affect anything with live action. However, anything happening with the live action world did directly affect these animated projects. And the justification for these limitations, in my opinion, is absolutely asinine. It's incredibly stupid, and it is all so that people and audiences did not get confused with the characters. And let me just tell you, I have been watching animated DC shows since I was a little kid, and never once did I think, as a little 5, 10-year-old boy watching Batman the Animated Series with Kevin Conroy and the Batman 2004, I never thought those universes were one and the same. I never got those versions of Batman confused with each other. Do you want to know why? Well, for one, they had very different animation styles. Another reason, they had different voice actors. So to me, this just feels like DC saying a lot of their fans are stupid, in my opinion, which makes absolutely no sense. To think that we would not be able to tell the difference between multiple different versions of different characters. So instead of trying to make those different versions a little more nuanced and have different characteristics while still honoring the character they are representing, no, instead we're going to place limitations on said characters so they just can't appear, which is absolutely absurd to me. And in my opinion, there was a definite negative effect to this, and it's really unfortunate because it leaves a lot on the table, and it leaves us DC fans often wondering what could have been and what these different stories could have been if these limitations were not placed by this studio for no other reason other than not to have fans confused, which again to me is absolutely silly. And by the way, most of this information is coming from CBR.com and a couple articles from journalists that did interview either the creators of Justice League Unlimited, Justice League, Batman the Animated Series, The Batman, every project that was essentially impacted directly. But back to the impact on the actual projects. So, getting to the actual projects that were impacted, because again, it was just animated projects that did come out in the early 2000s and mid 2000s. So, first and foremost, we do have an entry from the DCAU, a universe that I often praise so much for being my absolute favorite comic book universe. So, to learn that there were this many limitations placed on this amazing of a show is honestly really remarkable, considering how amazing the show was despite all these limitations. And that's why a lot of characters were not allowed to appear in Justice League Unlimited. That is the show that was directly impacted, as Justice League the Animated Series had technically ended before the embargo did take effect. But that still means there were limitations. What were some of these limitations? Barbara Gordon was not allowed to appear either as Oracle or Batgirl, and she was a character that they did want to have in a storyline. However, instead they did have to replace her character and have her story be told with a different female character that is part of the expanded Justice League team. A couple other things were that no one from the Bat family was allowed to appear. Justice League Unlimited doesn't have any appearance from Alfred. It also has no appearances from Dick Grayson, Tim Drake, as I mentioned, Barbara Gordon, Commissioner Gordon. They were not allowed to appear. Now, the show did get a little creative, and they did technically have Nightwing appear. In the episode, I believe it is in season 3, where Huntress has to go through Bloodhaven, she's tracking down Black Canary. When they do that female fight club of superheroes, you see from a view of a building as Huntress rides through the city, and as it goes through, it looks to be either stone statues or gargoyles. However, one of these stone statues is clearly not a stone statue, and it is a silhouette of Nightwing. Now, it is all blacked out because, again, they had to get very creative, but us crazy fans definitely were able to see that and able to tell that that was indeed Nightwing, which to me is really cool that they were able to find little workarounds like that to help make the universe feel inclusive and make it feel like one big universe altogether. We're not just forgetting about what happened in the New Adventures of Batman or Batman the Animated Series. And that to me is just really awesome. Now, some of the other limitations that Justice League Unlimited did have, the usage of Batman's villains. And as you can tell, not a single one of his actual villains appears in that series. The Joker was very restricted, although he was allowed to appear. They put heavy restrictions on him, mainly because The Dark Knight was coming out right around this time. So they had very strict rules to the point where it would have essentially changed his character. And not only that, the 2004 The Batman series was also coming out, and they had the Joker on there as well. So they would have had limitations from the Dark Knight trilogy and also from the Batman series. So because of that, they just decided we are going to stay away from the Joker as well, and especially other characters like the Scarecrow was going to be someone who was involved with the Legion of Doom, and also in the Cadmus arc, he was going to be at that round table. However, instead, they did decide to replace him with Hugo Strange. Hugo Strange has no speaking lines in Justice League Unlimited. This was also part of the limitation. They were allowed to physically appear in some ways. However, a lot of the dialogue, or how much dialogue they were allowed to give, was very limited. And again, that is just very unfortunate in my opinion. Now, going on to some of the other projects that were directly affected, one being the 2004 The Batman series. Now, this is something that I did actually talk about in my last couple of videos, one being the Batman 2004 season 6, and another being the Batman 2004 is underrated. If you want more details on the limitations from that show, go check out those two videos. I don't want to rehash it here again, but basically, long story short, they just had to reinvent certain characters and create certain characters like Gearhead, Ethan Bennett. These were all things that they had to do and changes they had to make to fit their story because they weren't allowed to use certain characters that they wanted to use. And even the characters they used were very limited. Specifically Robin, and that's why Batgirl actually appears before Robin, because Robin was at the time appearing in Teen Titans. And speaking of Teen Titans, we cannot forget how limited Teen Titans was as a series. As you know, you have the 5 core Teen Titans members. However, it really never expands beyond that as far as being related to the greater DC universe. Any character we meet is always a sidekick-esque character, as Justice League characters weren't really allowed to appear, as this show was essentially coming out and airing right around the time of Justice League Unlimited. So they did not want Justice League characters to then appear in this show because it was technically viewed as a Batman project, as the main character is a member of the Bat family. And then obviously Batman was not allowed to appear in this series either. And even in the last episodes of season 1, where they do end up having that battle on top of Wayne Tech, that was something that got some pushback from studios. However, they did allow it because there was no direct reference to Batman. However, obviously, if you just read the sign, it says Wayne, you are going to know that that is Wayne Enterprises, Wayne Tech, whichever you want to call it, whichever it was in that universe. I think it was Wayne Tech. But still, not being able to see the character of Batman appear in that series is a real bummer. I feel like there were some really cool opportunities for Batman to appear, specifically with all of the Deathstroke stuff, which they couldn't even call him Deathstroke, and that's a whole nother thing. That's why they called him Slade, which I will say, I don't totally hate, because Slade was badass. So that one I'm slightly okay with, even though it's still silly. I at least understand that one. But going on to another project that was directly impacted by the Bat embargo was Static Shock. As you may know, Batman did appear in season 2 of Static Shock, accompanied by the Joker and yes, Robin. However, in season 3, they did want Batman to once again appear in Static Shock. This was technically viewed as okay because it was the same version of Batman that was used in Justice League Unlimited, same voice actor, and same character design to a point. They slightly darkened his outfit a little bit, and I feel like in Justice League Unlimited, it was a little bit more bluish versus this is more dulled out and more gray, especially in the cape. However, when they did bring Batman back for season 3, they were not allowed to have Robin in the series, and that is because at that time, Teen Titans was going on, and the main character, the main protagonist of Teen Titans, was indeed Robin, so they weren't allowed to use him. They actually did mention Teen Titans in that show, and that is why they did it, because they knew on one hand they had to acknowledge that Robin is no longer there, and on the other we can promote this other show that we are doing. That's not to say that the Teen Titans Robin and the DCAU Robin are one and the same. That's actually very factually wrong. It can't be right. The timelines would not match up. So that's not what I'm saying at all. It was just a fun little throwaway line that could explain why Robin is not in this series, even though he was in it a season before. Then if you go to the next season, we do have Tim Drake appear. They were allowed to use Tim Drake for a couple of reasons. One, they did make it very clear that this is a different version of Robin. He is very different from Dick Grayson, who is the Robin in Teen Titans. And also, he did not appear in a ton of the episode, as most of the episode takes place in the future when Static Shock does get sent to the future and meets Terry McGinnis and a future Bruce Wayne. So that is how they kind of skated around having Robin once again be in Static Shock. And I find it really remarkable when shows are able to do that and able to navigate the difficult decisions that studios decide to make, and they still give us a really enjoyable product. And with that being said, that is essentially all that was directly affected and impacted by the Bat embargo. Now, was it a whole lot? No, not necessarily. But did it still take away a lot from fans? Yes, absolutely. I feel like Justice League Unlimited, the Batman, every single single one of these projects would have been greatly enhanced if these limitations weren't placed on it. And that's not to say that other heroes don't deserve their moment in the sunshine. Not at all. Other villains don't deserve their moment to shine. Absolutely not. But Batman, without a doubt, has the greatest rogues gallery. The only person who even competes with him as far as villains is Spider-Man. No one else has the level of rogues that Batman has. So to put that many limitations on his villains, especially when season 3 of Justice League Unlimited is literally about the Legion of Doom and literally about a whole shit ton of villains teaming up together to take on this expanded Justice League, that just seems really absurd to me. Why would you handicap yourself in that way? Put that many restrictions and limitations on what I consider to be the very bright spot of DC, because to me, I feel like DC has always thrived in their animation department, whereas in live action, it has been very hit and miss, especially since the Dark Knight trilogy. So I feel like them doing that is just really silly. I am happy that for the most part, the Bat embargo doesn't really exist anymore, and any part of it that does still exist has lightened up so much. I mean, Batman and Batman's villains appear in Harley Quinn. They appeared in the Tomorrowverse. They appeared in the DC AMU. Batman Brave and the Bold brought a lot of those characters back. So all in all, they are lightening up a ton of the restrictions with a lot of those characters. However, I do personally wish that it was just never a thing, because it often makes me wonder how much different and how much better those shows could have been if all of those silly limitations were just not there, because they weren't there for legal reasons. They were just a studio decision to take away confusion from fans, and us DC fans would prefer no limitations, and if people get confused, so be it. It won't water down the characters, and especially not the characters from Batman, because he does, like I said before, have the best rogues gallery in my opinion. But let me know what all of you think. Which show do you think was most negatively impacted by the Bat embargo? And which show do you think could have been most improved if the Bat embargo never existed? Let me know in the comments below. And while you guys are down there, please, for me, like this video, subscribe to the page, and hit that noti bell. And I'll see all of you in the next video. Goodbye.